Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Scrubbed In Show. I hope you've all been keeping well. This week, I'm joined by Meri Beckwith, who is the co-founder of Lindus Health, who are building a next-gen CRO to help deliver end-to-end clinical trials for the health and life sciences industry. And prior to venturing into the world of health tech, Meri was in the corporate world, particularly in venture capital, angel investing. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show today. How are you?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Abdul. Great to be here, and yeah, love the chance to talk about clinical trials as always.
So you've had a bulk of your career in the corporate sector, in venture investing. The first question we're all wondering is why health tech? How do you transition into the world of healthcare?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, I've spent most of my career in venture capital, which is basically investing in small private companies. Um, but very quickly, within that, I actually specialized into like covering kind of healthcare and life sciences. So I was the guy, who would sort of review all the sort of incoming health tech, life sciences opportunities on the team. And as it progressed a bit, I started leading my own investments. So like being, end to end responsible for kind of meeting entrepreneurs, doing due diligence, and then like joining the board of companies once we invested. And so I guess the question is like, why did I focus on, what led me to focus on health tech, biotech companies?
Hmm.
I think it's pretty simple. Like, in venture capital, most venture capital funds will invest in companies in any sector. And, it was either like invest in like the 10th grocery delivery app or invest in someone who's trying to fix like more of a real problem or more of like a pressing problem in healthcare. And the way I saw it was, yeah, sure, scaling in healthcare is a lot harder, but if you get it right, firstly, you can just do some good. And secondly, you can build a much more kind of sustainable business because the things that are making it hard for you to scale are also the things that are putting off, the 50 other people who would pile in and build, whatever grocery delivery apps if that's what you were doing. Yeah, so that's kind of how I got interested in it. Oh yeah, and then I've always been interested in biotech and stuff. Like did biology at uni. Yeah, and so it just felt like a very natural evolution for me. Uh,
Fair. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask is personality traits. So a lot of investors or people that work in venture, they don't really go and start up companies themselves. It was like a very few number. I don't know what the stats are, but I remember speaking to a few investors. It was an itch. Did you see something before going and co-founding Lindus Health? And would you say the personality traits are different? Were you able to kind of transfer a few of the skills you had working in venture to co-founding a company? And what was something you learned completely that was, out there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, yeah, I definitely had like a kind of simmering like anxiety about, it's kind of weird, right? Just to be like spend most of your career investing other people's money and other people's companies. And I just had this kind of like burning itch that I really wanted to build and do something myself. Um, but I didn't, played with a few ideas, didn't really find anything I liked, and then just very organically became increasingly obsessed with this problem in clinical trials and yeah, it just felt very very obvious. Um, and sorry, yeah, the second part of your question was kind of what skills transfer over. Um, if you go on Twitter and stuff, you'll see tons of memes about VCs who try and become founders, and it's a massive
Yeah.
failure. I don't know; it's too early to say whether whether we failed or succeeded yet, but like I'm pretty happy with how things are going so far. I think the skills that hmm, because the fundraising is obviously part of a significant part of being a startup founder. It's far 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 from everything, but like being an investor can help you hack and gain that a bit. um I would say like generally to try and be a good investor you just need to like learn really quickly, so like learn about this new industry quickly, to try and like have a decent conversation with founders, to try and like figure out what investments to make. And that maps pretty well into being a founder because you just need to learn a little bit about tons of different areas of running a company in order to be able to hire for people, let alone to actually do the job yourself. So I think that maps pretty well on, as well as like just generally having a good network,
Hmm.
having sort of a network of people you could try and hire, potentially go to for feedback. Being a VC investor, which is also about maintaining a network for those same reasons, helps too. Yeah. And
No,
sorry, there was a third part to your question, which I've now forgotten. But
no, that's fine.
um,
And
yeah,
that kind of brings me nicely on to kind of Lindus Health. Tell us the origin story of that and how you kind of navigated the first few days, the first few weeks. I think people kind of see what you're doing now, but we're interested to hear how the first few days were, the first few weeks, the obstacles you
Oh wow.
faced. I'm taking you
Yeah.
back, right?
It seems like a different like a different world. It was only, less than 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Uh so yeah, I think, we were very conscious, like me and my co-founder Michael, were very conscious that neither of us are clinicians, neither of us are, we're not like we're not like deep experts in sort of the area of clinical trials. We're just, in our 20s and stuff. Uh and so like we tried to speak to a lot of people who were experts, and I think we almost spent like probably too much time doing that because we had, imposter syndrome, and we probably
Hmm.
would have been better off had we just been like, building things, trying to sell different things from earlier on. But anyway, it was a lot of like speaking to a lot of different people, figuring out how the market worked, where the gaps are. um and we'd always had this like founding vision or thesis that the problem with clinical trials was principally with contract research organization model. Now,
Mm.
I can get into that. Would it be helpful if I like went through a bit
Yeah, I
about?
think it'd be quite helpful
Yeah.
just to kind of set the tone what it is and what it means.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, this is like, it's like a really one of these like really weird but huge industries that not many folks have heard of. But essentially, all new drugs need to undergo clinical trials to show they're safe and effective. And most clinical trials are run by a class of commercial companies called contract research organizations, or CROs for short. And so if you're a pharma company, you'll go to them and say, hey, run this clinical trial for me. Um, and that's kind of where the problems start. And I'd always been obsessed with clinical trials because they've just been getting exponentially more expensive over time,
Yeah.
which is really bad when you think about it. I mean, well, despite all the advances in technology and our understanding of human biology, the actual, running these clinical trials has just become exponentially expensive to the point where, if that continues, like literally progress in medicine stops, right? Which is kind of insane. Um, and I'd always been curious about why, like what could be going wrong. And if you look at it, it becomes pretty obvious that it's a problem about just how we run clinical trials, which then becomes a
Hmm.
problem about how CROs run clinical trials, because they are effectively the clinical trial industry. And looking into it, it became super clear that essentially their business model, the typical CRO business model, means that the worse your clinical trial goes, the more money you make. And so, okay, well, that kind of starts to explain things. And this matched with the experience I'd had in my venture capital career, where these companies we'd worked with had just had terrible experiences getting CROs to run their trials. Things always went, were too slow. They didn't seem to care, and it all started to make sense. And that's when I kind of knew that we sort of knew what we needed to do with Lindus Health, which is build sort of a different model for running clinical research end to end.
No, definitely, and that's interesting. The other thing I wanted to mention is, do you think there was kind of like a monopoly at play, a handful of big CROs in the world working with these big pharma companies and kind of controlling it end to end? So the question I wanted to ask is, a lot of people want to work with pharma, right? As soon as you add pharma, the market cap increases, it looks nice and juicy for investors. Tell us, how that world works. Did you face any barriers to entering it? You guys are the new kid in the block. There are, CROs that have been in the UK, let's say, for the last 15, 20 years, even longer. What was that like, and how are you navigating that space?
Yeah, good question. So, in short, we do have pharma clients. We actually tend to work more with kind of smaller, let's say even pharma companies or startups. But like,
Hmm.
working with pharma is no joke. I mean, their processes are just so huge and bureaucratic. They're almost designed to like weed out startup companies, which is
Yeah.
incredibly frustrating as a startup founder. But that's why I think it's important that you just don't bank on working with pharma for like the first, let's say, 2 years that you're even in commercial development, or even live. Uh, but I think the first part of your question there was about whether there's a monopoly, and essentially yes. So
Okay.
being a CRO is also not easy. You need to there's regulatory certifications you need to have. Mostly, you just need to have a kind of footprint and like a level of service offering that means a pharma company, you can tick all the boxes for the pharma company. And so that makes it very hard for new entrants to kind of enter the market. what we were able to do is basically find very initially very simple clinical trials with
Yeah.
non-pharma customers, run those, pretty successfully, and then sort of scale up from there and build up stepwise. Whereas I think, for others have just tried to go straight in selling to pharma and have found that very difficult. Yeah, but it's much easier now that we're selling to pharma, where we've got 90 clinical trials under our belt.
Yeah.
We can show them lots of results, all the certifications, etc. It's much easier to have that conversation now than if we just started by going direct to pharma.
Tell us the first clinical trial you managed to onboard at a company, where they're paying, did you have to do pilots, and kind of how you worked through it? Because now you've got 90 clinical trials under your belt. It's kind of your bread and butter. But tell us about that first one, how you're feeling once you landed it, successfully completing it.
Yeah, no. So our first clinical trial we ran kind of entirely end to end was with a company called Habitual. It was a combination of like medical device and total diet replacement for type 2 diabetes. Yeah, really interesting trial. We gave them a good deal because they were our first customer. But we were still able to run it, I think, in like a third of the time, or actually in exactly a third of the time that
Oh,
the
wow.
next fastest CRO had sort of promised them. So, even though we were just getting started, we could just go a lot faster by just, recruiting all the patients directly, running it in a decentralized manner, using just innovative software around keeping patients, reminding patients of visits and so on. It just helped the whole thing progress a lot more smoothly. And then, since then, and that was like a year ago, we've just been able to build out that platform to accommodate much more complex, particularly phase 2, 3, and 4 drug studies. Yeah.
That's amazing. And when you say run the trial faster, where are kind of the bottlenecks when it comes to running clinical trials? Is it kind of recruiting patients? Is it the data collection? Where are the bottlenecks? And how do
Yeah,
you
so
win? Yeah.
pretty much both and all of the above. I mean,
Oh,
I
wow.
think, the first big one is just the getting the study set up. And what a CRO would typically take, 6 months to get a study set up between, signing a contract and having patients in the door. And a lot of that time is spent, just finding subcontractors to set up like the study database, all the technology, the sites, which is really crazy when you think about it. And so we eliminate a lot of that by just doing it all ourselves. So our recruitment model means we need to work with fewer sites. We've built our own technology platforms. We can get that configured in a couple of weeks instead of a couple of months. Our own database, data capture, etc. So that's already provided a big boost in terms of speed. And then the second big area where clinical trials tend to slow down is patient recruitment. And this is an interesting one because if you talk to anyone in pharma or biotech and ask them what their biggest problem with clinical trials is, they'll usually say patient recruitment. But, our view is that patient recruitment is like a symptom of the problem, and the underlying problem is just poorly designed and run clinical trials. Often what will happen is, you'll design a clinical trial and unwittingly just make it impossible to recruit patients for that trial because you've added in too many exclusion criteria.
I see.
And so the fix there is no amount of patient recruitment support is going to fix that, but it's just re-examining the design of your study. Or another one we see a lot is like people have designed their study in like a total vacuum without reference to how patients are actually being treated in that condition. For instance, they've designed a study looking for patients with, what's an example? A certain type of, postpartum depression, and the study sites are not actually where postpartum depression patients are being treated.
Oh,
And
interesting.
so then, you're not going to recruit any patients then. So, so really seeing how the whole clinical trial fits together, as well as having a kind of unique way to recruit patients, is how we're able to recruit patients just much faster. And it also helps that like most CROs, they literally make more money the slower patient recruitment goes, which is completely crazy. And our business model means, we don't. We're just tied to how quickly we can deliver the study. So I think that helps too. Yeah.
No, interesting. I wanted to ask, what is kind of your North Star? What does success look like for you? Only because we know when it comes to pharma, when you're testing or you're trying to get a drug to market, it can take decades. How does that look like for you? And how does it feel when you're working on longer timelines? I know compared to other series, you're probably a fraction, but in the grand scheme of stuff.
Yeah. It's a good question. So our North Star is just simply customer satisfaction. So, we do NPS of all of our customers once we've kind of got halfway through and then completed their clinical trial. Our NPS is 100, which is great. So straight 10 out of
Amazing.
10s. And that's simply that's our North Star metric. That's what we try and optimize for. But you're right that, because clinical trials can take, even 6 months to a year on our platform, they're still, we still need leading indicators. And so for us, it's just hitting our timelines
Yeah.
for setup, for patient recruitment, for study closeout, and just making sure we can hit and exceed those, as well as, in the longer term, what we really want to be known for is producing higher quality data, because I think that's the area where the industry is just like terrible. It's just shocking. Just the very poor quality, poor consistency of how data is captured, stored, and coded. And so longer term, that's what we really want to be known for. But while we're still young, we're just making sure, we hit our timelines, and then obviously all the data is, acceptable and leads to publications and regulatory submissions. But
No, amazing. And when it comes to the actual patient recruitment, how does that bit work? Because I remember while in medical school, so it's a while ago, we used to go to these clinics, and on the wall there'll be like printouts of papers
yeah,
saying, there's a clinical trial. Do you have a patient, a certain age, a certain ethnicity with certain medical conditions? And he's like, recommend them for this trial. And then there's like a stipend paid. Is it still the same like posters in doctors' offices and hospitals? Or has it changed?
nope, hasn't really changed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. You know, the one lever typically people will pull to increase patient enrollment is just add more sites to a clinical trial, which is so
Okay.
crazy to me. And it's to the point where like the average site maybe recruits one patient per month to a clinical trial. So if you
Oh,
think about
wow.
how like insanely inefficient that is, firstly, you're polluting your data because sites will add variability and your analysis will need to take that variability into account. So you are literally making the quality of your data worse. Secondly, it's pretty expensive. I mean, it's 50 to 100K per site you add basically to a clinical trial. And if you're doing that all to get, 3 or 4 patients over the lifetime of a study, it's pretty inefficient. Um, so what we do is just kind of, turn the model on its head and go, sites are just where the study assessments happen. We recruit patients centrally, and
Okay.
we'll find them, we'll screen them centrally, and then send them into the minimum number of sites possible to actually complete the study assessments. That's obviously a lot faster. It's a lot lower cost, and we reduce the amount of variability between sites, which is critical.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's kind of how we approach that, and yeah, so definitely not just relying on posters like in a waiting room
Yeah.
that everyone ignores, but rather sourcing patients directly from the community. Yeah.
No, definitely. And I wanted to ask, does it not make sense to have something centrally controlled when it comes to patient recruitment, clinical trials? Companies come, it's probably the same problem with data in the NHS, right? Where it should be this central source of patients that are willing and happy to go on these clinical trials, and then companies come to them and pay whatever it takes to cost. Does that not exist? And what is the problem if that's comes to market or something like that?
Do you mean like the sort of centralized model of like patient recruitment and
Yeah. So rather than having to go to let's say separate companies, wouldn't it make sense to kind of run it through the government or who have access to thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of patients?
So yeah, that's a good question. So essentially, this is what the UK tries to do with the NHS, where like
Yeah.
I know you and a lot of your listeners have worked in the NHS, and the mentality is like, oh, we just have to do everything ourselves because we're the NHS, and
Yeah.
honestly, it just doesn't work. I mean, like, um, I don't know. I mean, our experience of working with the NHS, particularly in secondary care, has been like, it's just endless bureaucracy because no one's really incentivized or empowered to like actually get
Mm.
things moving and make things happen. You just end up caught in these like endless cycles, committee meetings, and oh, you need a research passport, and oh, you need special training, and
Yeah.
just nothing ever gets moving. So unfortunate. But yeah, you're right that in theory, the NHS is like probably the best data set in the world for clinical trial recruitment. Longitudinal data set around, and this is actually we do actually use this data in primary care records, but in secondary care as well. Just an incredible data set. But in theory, but in practice, it's spread across different trusts who all have different
Yeah.
committees that need to approve things and so on. Um, but yeah, and I think that's why, I mean, if you look at, unfortunately, like the UK is one of the least popular countries in Western Europe now, certainly. and a lot more popular than most countries in Eastern Europe when it comes to running clinical trials. And it's
Oh
basically
wow.
this: it's just this buildup of bureaucracy, particularly in the NHS, that just makes it very difficult for companies, which is sad, among a few other reasons. But yeah.
Yeah, because I can imagine a lot of our listeners thinking it, and in theory, it all sounds all nice and great, but the reality and practical aspects of it, it's just it's not there yet. I
Yeah.
wanted to ask AI. Is it a buzzword? It's been around, and I imagine it's been involved in drug discovery for a while. Tell us what your thoughts are in AI when it comes to kind of drug discovery, recruitment, clinical trials. Is it like a savior? Is it something that's augmenting things for you, helping you? Keen to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah. Cool. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say go so far as to say like a savior, but at the
Yeah,
moment, and I think it's going to be like the internet, right? Where like it's not going to change overnight, but things will
yeah.
change hugely within like 10 years. And I think we're seeing a bit of that where today, we're using AI in a bunch of different places, a little bit in patient recruitment, a little bit in kind of document generation. And it's making our lives like 20% easier in all these different places. And we're
Hmm.
finding new use cases for it every day. Like we've just built and demoed and published a tool that can basically generate protocols and documentation you might need for a clinical trial. So it basically means that you can design a protocol as like a piece of machine readable software with different endpoints, and then turn that into a full protocol. Use
Oh,
the
nice.
LLM to just write a full protocol off the back of it. But yeah, so that's pretty cool. And other use cases like generating forms and stuff you need to have to satisfy ethics committee requirements, or at least generating a first draft that you can then edit. I do think it's important to call out that like in the clinical research field, you're not just going to have like a completely automated process. You always need
Hmm.
humans in the loop, which is
Of
fair
course.
enough. But yeah, I'd say at the moment it's kind of making a bunch of things 10-20% easier.
No.
In 5 years, I don't know though. It could
Yeah.
it could become pretty transformational. But yeah, we'll see.
No, definitely, and I agree with you on that. So let's talk about the money side of things. You recently announced a few months ago you did an $80 million raise. Congrats on that, with investors, who are revered like Peter Thiel, backers from Spotify. Tell us about the fundraising journey. And a lot of the listeners, they struggle when it comes to fundraising. They don't know how to go about it. How do you get that first check? How do you get a buy-in? So keen to hear your journey with regards to that, and obviously how Peter Thiel came into the picture.
Yeah, sure. So, I was fortunate that I used to work in kind of venture capital, and I think it does help you. You can kind of, you can kind of know how the system works. I guess the first thing I'd say is, it's definitely not for everyone, because venture capital investors are looking for like a very specific type of company. It's generally a company that could grow quickly to be worth, to dominate a market.
Yeah.
And so that narrows it down a lot. And I think the first step, if you do want to raise venture capital investment, is just kind of understanding that and presenting a coherent plan, or like firstly presenting, that your ambition is to do that, to grow, to dominate an entire market, and then sort of suggesting that you have like a plan for how to get there. Um, and so like the pitch for us was like, pretty simple. Like, look, clinical research industry, it's huge, 60-70 billion dollars, but very, very poor, customer feedback, very poor outcomes generally. So that's like a great foundation already, because
Yeah.
VCs love both of those things. Um, and then, our proposition is we're going to disrupt it with a new model for running entire clinical trials, blah, blah, blah. Then the problem becomes like, okay, well, that's like really ambitious. How are you going to do that as a small startup? And then for us, it's like, look, we're just going to be really focused on small studies initially, and then build up from there. And so we just kind of broke down this big, ambitious vision into a series of small steps that investors could get comfortable with. I think was kind of how we presented it. And that was for our seed round. And then, the Series A was kind of the same, but like, hey, look, here's the progress we made in like a year and a half. And we started really simple, and now we're running, let's say up to we could run half of all clinical trials, and isn't this great? And so, yeah, that's kind of the same story, just, a bit further along the journey. And with Peter Thiel specifically, we were introduced by an angel investor who has invested in our original, like our first round. And kind of a fan of his sort of thinking and his framework, for how he thinks from first principles
Yeah.
about different markets. And I think he could also see that the clinical research industry is pretty pretty screwed up and pretty fundamental to to how we make progress in a very important area of human health. And so, yeah, kind of backed us on that basis. Yeah.
No, incredible. One of the fears founders have, and I was literally speaking to a founder the other day, is as a startup grows, as you do bigger and bigger fundraisers, how do you continue staying in the driving seat? Let's say, you get to a point you've just raised 100 million, you're not hitting those targets. How do you prevent yourself from being removed and replaced? How do you, it's a trick question, and I'm sure you may have seen it a few times when you were in venture.
Yeah, I mean, I think, simply put, if you and the company are continuing to perform, then it would be mad for investors to try and replace you.
Mm-hmm.
When you've seen this with, the OpenAI stuff
Exactly. Yeah.
over the weekend, over the last week. I mean, that company is performing extremely well. There's clearly some dispute around, like ethics in AI and whatever, some kind of almost intellectual dispute. And the rest of the board and the biggest investor, Microsoft, have very clearly backed Sam and the OpenAI team and just done whatever it takes to keep them in the driving seat. So I think, I think that's basically it. I mean, as long as the company is performing well, it would just be completely crazy for investors to move you out. Yeah. I mean, of course, there are lots of ways that things can go wrong as a company. I think everyone you can sort of outgrow your skill set maybe, which does happen and so on. But generally speaking, yeah, it's just, line go up, things will be fine.
No,
Easier said than
definitely,
done, but yeah.
definitely. And I think the one thing we saw from Sam was kind of the loyalty and the love his employees and the people who worked with had for him. How have you built that culture where, everyone enjoys coming to work, you love the mission, you love what you're building, especially early stage when you're doing your first few hires, when you're growing out the team, how have you built a culture?
Yeah, that's a really big question. I mean, yeah, that's a really tough one. Because you're never done building the culture, and it's always
Yeah.
a battle. I would say like the one thing we've tried to consistently do is be kind of really obsessed with employee feedback. So we run like
Yeah.
quarterly employee surveys. Every person on the team, even now, has like one of the founders who is their mentor, and they check in every few weeks. And the purpose of that is to like ask for their feedback on how things are going, try and make sure that like Lindus Health can be the best place for people's development
Yeah.
long term. So, basically treating your employees, obsessing over them like you would obsess over customers, I think is kind of what we've done. Although I wouldn't say that we've cracked by any means how to build like a great company culture. Even though, I think we're on the right track. But yeah.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
And what does it mean to be a good leader, a good CEO? How do you get people to buy in your vision? And how are the dynamics between you and your co-founder, and particularly when it comes to conflict?
Yeah.
How do you kind of go over that? So these are more for the founders listening in, kind of trying to make sense of it all.
This is honestly hard. I just I'm not sure where to start. I mean, I think the fundamentals are you need to recognize that ultimate responsibility stops with you for a ton of problems. And so, if things go wrong, even if maybe, let's say you had delegated a task to someone working with a customer, things went wrong, you just step in and you take responsibility for that and you try and fix it. You then also need to make sure you feed back to that person you worked with and say, hey, look, this is why this didn't work. You need to do this better next time. But I think people inherently respect and we'll just follow you if they kind of see that you're able to take ownership and ultimately take make the hard decisions when they need to be made. That also means like sheltering your team a lot. Like if you say you have you do need to project an air of kind of confidence and knowing what you're doing, even though you may
Yeah.
not. I think it's important to make sure that people feel they can rely on you. I think those are if you get those right, that's a pretty big part of it in my view. As well as like you might be feeling under a lot of pressure, but you try and not let that show and be a kind of positive, uplifting part of the culture for the team. Yeah.
And tell us about your co-founder, how you met, and the advantages of building a company with co-founders as to doing it as a solopreneur.
Yeah, definitely. So I would say in hindsight, I think I just would have been very, very difficult to build the company as a first-time solopreneur. I think that's
Yeah.
just really tough. There are just so many things that, you need to kind of do and learn before you can even like hire or delegate them. And I think it's just almost too much for one person, especially if
Hmm.
you've never kind of built a company before. Um, so I have two co-founders. So Michael, is actually an old friend of mine who I've known since university,
Oh,
and we
nice.
were, I was sharing an experience I had where I volunteered to take part in a few clinical trials and just had a terrible, terrible experience
Oh,
overall, like as a
wow.
patient. And, I also said that, and he'd been working in the space and in government and, policy, and he kept hearing complaints from folks in pharma about working with CROs. And then together we kind of realized that we were both kind of approaching the same problem. So that's kind of how we, how
Oh,
we
nice.
got into to founding Lindus. And then we got introduced to Nick, our third co-founder and CTO, who had been, he's a technologist by background, started his career at Google, and then,
Mm.
had, worked on a few startups, and then, was working at a place called Benevolent AI, who do AI
Okay,
for
yeah.
drug discovery. And he had noticed, he was like, okay, we have all this sophisticated machine learning, which we're using to discover new drug targets and target molecule combinations. But then once these drugs get into the clinic, which is when they build value, it's just
Yeah.
like a complete mess. And that's the
Oh,
thing,
wow.
that's the part that we need to fix. And so, yeah, we'd all kind of we'd all kind of experienced the problem that we're now solving from different vantage points. And yeah, it just became a pretty obvious that this is all what we wanted to work on.
You mentioned yourself, you went to do a few of these clinical trials. I always wondered what the motivations were for people to kind of enroll themselves into clinical trials. I would be super scared, just kind of the fear of something going wrong or I don't understand what's happening. What have you noticed, or what was your motivation to kind of get involved in these clinical trials as a patient?
Yeah. I started volunteering during COVID, and I think I was just really bored and pissed off.
Yeah,
It's,
I'm not
uh, you know,
surprised. Yeah,
I did some like volunteer vaccinating, but I thought, the best thing I could do to help bring this, bullshit to an end was
yeah,
to do everything I could to help bring a working vaccine. And so I volunteered for a few of mainly phase 2 and 3 vaccine trials, and eventually got accepted onto the Novavax phase 3.
oh,
Yeah.
nice. Mm. And what stops pharma companies from doing it all in house?
Yeah,
Why do they kind of have to go out to kind of these organizations to do the trials for them?
yeah, it's a really good question. So pharma, in the 90s, pharma used to do all of their clinical trials in house.
Okay.
They then had this kind of resource problem where, their need to run clinical trials would go up and down, and they don't want to maintain, a huge workforce and all this machinery. So they then started
Mm.
outsourcing a lot of them. And once they started outsourcing them, they realized that like, oh, this is great. We can just basically like become what they are now, which is kind of like almost an investment bank where they just move money between different clinical programs, and
Mm.
don't have to bear any of the overhead of actually running the clinical studies. But this then created the monster of the CRO industry because
Okay.
they have this monopoly. Pharma would much rather pay 5 times as much and reduce the risk of something going wrong in theory by like 10%. And so they've come to, just really rely on CROs who deliver like a dependably mediocre service. Um,
Interesting.
and so, now you have kind of the CRO. That's why the CRO industry looks the way it does, with
Okay.
a few very large players having the majority, and then a long tail of very small niche players. But no differentiation between the large players. They're all kind of, as I say, just mediocre, consistently slow, but consistent.
Mm. And do you think for a long time before Lindus Health came that why were people not too keen on innovating? It's just the way it was. Barriers to entry. No one really knew how it worked behind the scenes. I feel a lot of stuff when it comes to pharma, you don't know what actually is happening. You hear about it, you read about it, but the intricacies is a bit difficult for the individual.
Yeah, I mean, this is like, the CRO industry is just like this incredibly arcane, dusty industry.
Yeah,
People aren't likely. It's one of these things that's kind of in the background. You maybe hear about pharma that gets in the news, but as soon as you start talking like a second order back, it's like, okay, the people who enable pharma, then people just tend to lose interest. And so, it's
yeah.
kind of one of these like big shadowy industries that is really important, but that not many people have heard of. Yeah.
No, definitely. Yeah. I think it's nice founders or kind of people that are innovating the space can shed more light on it. And I think there's
Yeah.
loads of industries like this that exist in health tech, that may have low hanging fruits that people can go and innovate and solve and build kind of a sustainable business off the back of it. So thank you for sharing these insights. So I imagine for me and a lot of our listeners, it's the first time they're hearing, what even is a CRO and, how it all kind of works. I wanted to ask, what has been your biggest obstacle to date? Like a day when you are thinking, man, I hate this, I should stay in venture.
Yeah.
What has been the biggest struggle and how did you overcome it?
Yeah. So, okay, I think the biggest struggle is, conversations we have with customers where, like, there's one at the moment where, it's kind of a big biopharma company. We're looking at running a clinical trial for them. We know we can run it just way faster, way better than the other big CROs they're considering. But they're getting told by their board, it's like, you have to work with the big CRO. We don't care. We know they'll be bad. Um, uh, but it's just what you have to do. And that's really frustrating for us because it's like, there's kind of nothing we can do to stop that. It's like no one gets fired for hiring IBM.
Yeah.
Um, and then that's very frustrating. I think, we're also learning that a lot of investors in these biotech companies get kickbacks from CROs, right? And so, it helps to know that there's an incentive working there as well. But yeah, I think that's definitely the hardest thing. And it's just surmountable, like on a wide basis, right? Because we just need to find the companies who aren't so conservative and who kind of are, who do feel the pain of the constant delays, the cost overruns, which we know we can solve for. So, yeah, there are enough customers out there. We just need to find them. Yeah.
No, definitely. And I can imagine it being increasingly frustrating because we've had those similar experiences where you can do it better. You're doing it the new way of doing things, more efficient, cheaper, but they're kind of sticking to the incumbents. They're sticking to the people they've been doing business for a very, very long time. And it's
Yeah.
very difficult to kind of break that. And I imagine what you're doing, the Slack approach in terms of kind of going for the different ones and working your way to the top. Do you think you can crack it in the sense the big companies will one day use Lindus Health for running the end to end?
Oh yeah, 100%. Just a question of when we
Nice.
get there. We always want to go as fast as possible without,
Yeah.
breaking anything. So yeah, I mean, for me, it's kind of frustrating because we could be going that little bit faster in
Yeah.
terms of like winning more customers. But no,
Of course.
100%. I mean, already, I think you'd have to be completely crazy to work with a traditional CRO on a clinical study when you could work with someone like us for the simple reason that, our contracts are based on outcomes. So you only pay
Okay.
us when we
Interesting.
hit, milestones that make progress in the trial. CRO contracts are not based on outcomes; they're based on hours and inputs. And
Oh,
so
wow.
you're hiring this company for millions of dollars, and they're contractually obligated to do nothing, right? To seriously do nothing useful. And the way it ends up working is you end up having to micromanage them, which just takes up so much of your time. So I still think a lot of the smartest biotech entrepreneurs, life sciences entrepreneurs I've met just ended up doing it all in house, like building their own clinical research, like internal CROs, which is again what I would certainly do if we didn't exist, because I just don't understand why you'd ever work with a CRO who has no incentive and no contractual obligation to actually run your study. It's that
Yeah.
simple.
It's mind blowing.
Yeah.
The final question I want to ask before we let you go is advice to other founders, entrepreneurs that are thinking about starting a health tech startup or a company, maybe kind of in a normal day job. What helped you make that decision? Advice for them.
Yeah. I would say, if you've started a company, I mean, just, trust your instincts around hiring. And I think in particular, like the first few people you hire are so critical for the success of the company. Um, and ultimately kind of all you have is your kind of gut instinct and like, does this person, will this person contribute to the mission, et cetera? And just
Yeah.
don't be afraid to trust it. I think the mistake we made and a lot of other people make is like there are big gaps in your knowledge, oh, I don't
Yeah.
know about this whole area. And your first instinct is to hire someone who does and who's experienced. And that's almost always a mistake because if you don't know how that thing works, how can you know who to hire for it, right? And I think
Yeah.
also the more experience you tend to have, the less flexible you are in your thinking. And if you do hire someone, they just won't be flexible enough to kind of reinvent or do things differently. So yeah, I think that was definitely the biggest thing, just learning to trust our instincts when it came to hiring, and also along with that, like making sure that you understand at least a little bit about something before you try and delegate it or hire into it, because yeah, just trying to like hire blind like that is almost always going to be a disaster.
No, definitely. And I agree with you on that. I remember listening to a podcast on my first one about Native, the deodorant brand in America.
Hmm.
The chap had no idea about deodorants, but spent 6 months just religiously learning everything
Yeah,
about the industry, what works, what doesn't. And the thing was, if you believe genuinely you can solve a problem, even though you don't have kind of the domain expertise, you should kind of go out, learn about it, and it shouldn't really stop you from doing something. And it kind of echoes what you just said now, right? I imagine there was one day you were in venture, you knew nothing about clinical trials other than being a participant, and now you're running Lindus Health, which is amazing.
yeah, pretty much. And, yeah. I mean, I kind of knew high level that they were important and that there was
Yeah,
a
of course, yeah.
problem here. But like in terms of like the guts of running clinical trials, yeah, I was very, very naive, certainly. And luckily we obviously got up the learning curve quickly, and we have some awesome people on the team. Our whole clinical operations team who are
Yeah,
very much experts. But combine that with a real creativity and just ownership mindset that you don't get
amazing.
in a lot of companies in the space. So yeah.
Hmm. And is that something you look for when recruiting? Kind of this ownership, go getters, and just some thoughts on firing and hiring, right? How have you approached it? We'll be quite keen to hear.
Yeah. So yeah, 100%. I mean, in an early stage startup, nothing kind of happens unless you make it happen. And that goes to the
Hmm.
founders as well as kind of all members of the team. And so the people you hire need to have that ownership mindset where they're not just doing a job, they are answering a calling by joining your company. And so yeah, that is like definitely the most important thing, and just that motivation and sense of connection with the mission. And yeah, and sorry, I forgot the first part of your question.
It was what do you look for when recruiting?
Okay,
Uh,
yeah, yeah, no,
and
just
then
that ownership. Yeah, and sorry, the second one.
the second one is dealing with firing. So they say hire
Oh yeah,
fast, fire fast. A lot of people struggle with the firing part. Even when we work with team members who aren't performing, it's always a difficult conversation. You don't know how to really go about it.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's not fun.
Hmm.
But I think if you're having kind of sustained doubts about someone, let's say for more than like a week,
Hmm.
that's just almost certainly a sign that they're not right. And it sucks.
Yeah,
And particularly when like sometimes we have people who are a great culture fit, but who just they're just not set up to do the job right. And often it's not even their fault. Like often it's kind of you sort of miss, or things change so quickly that you thought this would be a need, but it isn't. And I
I
think
see.
you have
Fair
to
enough.
recognize that like no one benefits from someone staying in a job that they're just not cut out for, because they're not going to develop. The company isn't getting what it needs, and so often it can be the best thing for both parties. But yeah, it does absolutely suck.
No,
Yeah,
that is fair. No, thank you, Mary, for taking the time out to talk. I feel like we've talked about a lot of things
yeah,
across the board, which is helpful because we want to get out as much information from your insights and your experiences. But it's been an absolute pleasure. No doubt, Linda's Health will continue to grow. We are going to champion you even more. But thank you so much, buddy.
cool. Yeah, no, thanks so much, Abdul, for chatting with me, and yeah, hope to chat again soon.
No worries. Thank you.
Cool.
Just there.